US election and the foreign policy, does it really matter? I'm Pete Apps. I'm a Reuters Global Affairs columnist, and I am also Executive Director of the Project for Study of the 21st Century. Still, I think, one of the newest think tanks out there. We're about 14 months old. We started January of 2015, and since then we've done just over 60 events in London, Washington, DC, and New York. I've got a great panel here today. I'm introducing very quickly. We're going to keep this very conversational. We are live streaming, and which means that this video will also be up on YouTube afterwards. From my left, we've got Nik Gvosdev, Professor of National Security Studies at the US Naval War College, a Russia expert, a more general geopolitics expert, someone with whom I've been shooting the breeze on international affairs throughout the last 6 or 7 years, as it's gradually got worse and worse and worse. We told each other so. Julia Clark, a pollster at Ipsos, who I first met during the 2010 election campaign in the UK. One of the best pollsters I know, usually right, is going to tell us what the American people really think, which doesn't necessarily come across every discussion in DC. Asha Castleberry, US Army officer, now reservist, Pierce Front Global Fellow, as is Julia and Nick's one of our advisors, served in the ISIS war in Iraq, now doing various things back in the US, including being part of the Truman National Security Project, and Alex Ward, deputy head of the Scowcroft Center at Atlantic Council, again, one of DC's up-and-coming foreign policy specialists, and someone who's been writing a lot about the foreign policy of a President Trump, amongst other things, which we'll get his thoughts on in due course.
It's been a dark year.
I mean, Nick, I wanted to start with you. I mean, you wrote an article for National Interest about a month or so ago, talking about
promotion.
talking about the commonalities between Bush and Obama, and the idea that the occupants, the last occupants of the White House, actually haven't varied maybe as much as they thought, or maybe that they've each had the same kind of cycle. I mean, how talk a bit more about that. I mean, how much difference have we really seen?
I mean, this is an interesting point, that when you look at the last set of presidential elections, both the winners and the losers have all said, if we're elected, we'll bring in a different team, we'll have a different approach, policy will be different. And then we look at the trajectory of both the Bush and Obama administrations, and they're similar. They're not identical, and I think it's important to stress that. Oh, actually, since we are live streaming, I'll back up and do my disclaimer. Work for the U.S. government, not representing the U.S. government here, not the views of the U.S. government, my own personal opinion. All right. The trajectories are similar, not identical, but similar, in the sense that there have been a set of challenges that have faced both administrations. And those challenges have not been as receptive to the idea that, well, if we just had someone different in the Oval Office and a different team around the president, it would happen differently. And so let me just, a couple of the areas. So we have this, question about the efficacy of American intervention, in particular military intervention. Both administrations have struggled with that. How effective is the use of the military instrument as an instrument of foreign policy? Both administrations in their last year are dealing with challenges to American leadership, reluctance among allies, greater willingness of potential rivals to challenge. Both have grappled with the question of, is the Middle East reformable, and is U.S. power able to do that? Can it have much impact? Both have dealt with the question of trying to rebuild a good relationship with Russia. Both administrations started with the promise that they would do something different with Russia. They would succeed where their predecessors had failed, to deliver an actual constructive, strategic, special partnership with Russia. That was the line that the Bush administration used in the summer of 2001. Then, of course, 2009, the Obama administration unveils the reset. We will reset relations and get it going. And in both cases, both President Bush and then President Obama have been disappointed with how their relationships with President Putin has emerged. The differences are important. I will, again, it is important that the Bush administration involved us in a massive land war in Iraq, which the Obama administration has avoided, despite pressure on some to put more, quote, boots on the ground in various places in the Middle East. The character of why American standing in the world is affected is also different. When you look at the polling data in 2008, there was a visceral dislike of President Bush and his policies around the world.
And also an assumption that everything went wrong was the administration's
fault, right? Rather than
happened
these
anyway.
being structural problems or being issues of American leadership. With President Obama, his personal numbers are very high. He's liked around the world, but now you have this sense of, is the United States reliable? Can it live up to its commitments? If you've read that Jeffrey Goldberg piece that's in the Atlantic about President Obama, there's a quote from the King of Jordan: "We can't rely on it. America doesn't seem to be as reliable." So that's where you have some of this. Both, President Bush and President Obama did have some signature efforts whose ultimate fate may end up being in doubt. So President Bush pushed through a new relationship with India and tried to get some trade pacts with individual countries and tried to reorient American trade towards the Western Hemisphere. And then it wasn't clear whether those would get passed or not. They did get passed ultimately in the first year of the Obama administration. President Obama, of course, has taken a real gamble with the Iran deal that a future administration will not seek to modify that or change it, and that it can last. It can work to at least prevent Iran from going nuclear in the short term. And then also it's not clear, whether or not the Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic partnerships for trade, even if they're signed in the last year of the Obama administration, whether or not they would in fact be passed and Congress will move on that. So those are some of the issues that they're facing. Where I think some of this comes, what we're seeing playing out, what I had in the piece in the national interest is increasingly administrations are bound, some of it by limitations of their own making, some of it by the limitations in which they operate. And one of the things increasingly is that American policymakers believe that interventions must be low cost and low casualty. And that immediately begins to limit how effective you can be. If you believe that you cannot do certain things because you have a threshold for what the American public will accept.
That's movable though, right? Because I think that's been constant for the last 25, 30 years. It's just 9/11.
9/11 was a shock that moved it temporarily, and then it came back. And as long as you don't have the sense of an existential crisis. And then, what we're seeing as we move forward is one of the things up to, other than the two kind of outlier candidates, which I'll briefly conclude on at the end here. And when you look at the candidates that are running this year, most of them aren't proposing things too radically different than what the Obama administration is already doing. The argument is, well, we can do it more effectively, we will have a better team, we will have a mandate, but not that you don't really see.
I want to come back to those candidates in a second.
And that's,
but I want to throw it to Julia actually now. That's the kind of bigger picture. But what do the US people actually want? They want all this. They want the rest of the world to go away.
Basically, yes. They absolutely, per your point, do not want more boots on the ground anywhere. I think, and I should be clear, I do polling. I have no expertise in foreign policy as a subject matter, so I will defer to the other panelists for those things. But I can provide context in terms of the public and where the public are coming to this issue, which is exactly as you said. They don't really care that much, to be totally honest, about the rest of the world, as long as it doesn't impact them. Foreign policy for Americans is seen almost entirely through a domestic lens. There's diffuse and acute issues, right? So the diffuse issues are, if the economy is ticking along well, that leaves a little room for concern about the economy to decline. It's always the number one issue, right? And other issues to percolate up. But foreign policy and foreign affairs is not number 2 or 3 or 4. It's number sort of 7 or 8 or 9. I think a good analogy is about the proportion of the budget spent on foreign policy is analogous to the amount of attention that Americans give it. It's small. And I think that when it is focused, it's because of a specific event, because typically a terrorist event, 9/11, but there are other events that can drive American public opinion in positive ways. I'm thinking about when we did initially put boots on the ground in Iraq, for example. There's a rally around the flag sort of mentality that comes, and you see support for the president or the leader go up. But it's far from their minds, and people are more concerned about the impact on their own families and their own pocketbook. And the lens also is, and I know we're not getting into the candidates yet, but around things like things like trade and
I was going to say, I was going to ask that.
Yeah.
So, with the terrorism/military thing, it's really, is anyone going to die? Is someone going to come here?
exactly. Am I under immediate
Is someone
threat?
going to come here and kill me, or is my son going to have to go somewhere else and get killed?
Yeah.
The trade thing is affects more families more time. If you're not in the military and you're not really unlucky, you're not going to run into a terrorist. Whereas if the trade thing affects everybody.
It does, but even so, when we ask explicitly about trade and explicitly about the role that America has in terms of setting up relationships with other countries and these impacts, it washes out. It's not seen as a foreign issue. It's seen as a domestic issue, and protectionism is at the top of the agenda. But people don't see that through the lens of a foreign affairs issue. They think, I want my little circle secure. And that's always the lens they'll come out of it. There's not a single politician who's going to sort of win or gain headway, I don't think, campaigning on this issue in particular. But I think, of course, the result will be very impactful.
I mean, it's kind of interesting because the trade thing, even within DC, it almost drifts off the bailiwick of something like Atlantic Council into something done by Treasury. I mean, Asha, looking at the kind of the hard-nosed military side of it, a conflict in the Middle East. I mean, how much? Given that no one's going to put boots on the ground anywhere, as far as we can make out, how much difference does who wins the election going to make to, say, the ISIS war?
Well, it depends, because inconsistency is what hurts us over time when we have one administration do one thing and then a new one comes in and it totally starts another. Just based on the candidates, as you mentioned, there's not really one candidate that's like really out there that kind of is going against Obama, saying, well, there's one. But
no one from the McCain kind of perspective, which would be lots of boots everywhere.
Right. But what we have right now is very limited. Unlike Afghanistan, we're kind of maintaining a certain posture, 10K, but in Iraq, it's very, very limited. So you don't really have too many concerns that, service member can get hurt while it's going on, like in 2008. However, depending on what that one outlier that's in the election right now, I don't really see much that somebody's going to really change the entire ISIS strategy that's going on right now.
I mean, Alex, would even Trump change the ISIS strategy that much?
Yeah, sorry, perils of going last. A lot of my points have been taken, so I'm going to.
But you also have a lot to respond to.
Yeah, no, so I'm actually going to touch upon, if you don't mind, what you said. What would Trump change? Yes, he has said, I'm going to bomb the shit out of them. Obama has said, I'm going to target kill some of them when they bother what I'm doing.
In other words, it would make a big difference in the population of Raqqa, but less the population of Aleppo.
Yeah, but actually, when it comes to like Raqqa, this was Cruz, like, I'm going to target carpet bomb. Let that one sink in for 4 seconds. Target carpet bomb a city. And not one Republican on the stage went, that's not a thing. On top of that, Trump was like, oh yeah, the nuclear triad's great. I was shocked. The moderator or no one on stage said, name the 3 parts of the nuclear triad. If I were a betting man, he wouldn't know it. Sidebar, I'm also shocked that Trump hasn't called Ted Cruz Raphael yet, but that you would think that would be a natural thing for him. Anyway, so Trump's foreign policy is 18th century, 19th century mercantilism. It is completely devoid of the current world, and touch upon trade. He is the one actually making this an international foreign policy issue, bringing it to the fore. It's China. We're losing jobs to China. We're losing jobs to Mexico. We're losing jobs to Canada. We're losing jobs everywhere, and it's hurting you. And the way we solve that is I'm going to somehow tax the Chinese at a magical 45% rate, and I'm also going to throw immigrants outside the United States. Interestingly, Sanders is actually making us an argument of the same issue, right? This kind of response against neoliberal trade neoliberal trade is the reason that middle America and real America is dying. And the way I'm going to solve that is by giving you a bunch of free stuff. And regardless, this backlash that Julia touched upon against this free trade regime is what's actually driving the foreign policy debate more so than not. Terrorism, I think, could make or break the campaign of either Trump or Clinton. And actually, in a similar way with Spain. If a terrorist attack happened, actually given within 3 months of the general, if it's between Trump and Clinton, which looks very likely, I don't see how the Democrats actually win. So that's actually it's an issue in the background. Who cares what the policy is? It's does ISIS actually pull something off? or some other group. And now that we're going after Al-Shabaab and all those other kinds of groups, the ability somewhat goes up. And then let me quickly touch upon sort of the rest of foreign policy, and I'll turn it back. Trump, interestingly, I'll put this in very simple terms so we can talk about this throughout the rest of the time. I would say the four main candidates that matter now would be Trump, Cruz, Sanders, and Clinton. I think we're finally within the last hours of the Rubio campaign and all the others. Trump is about better leadership. Government actually isn't the problem, right? It's not that, which is a very sort of anti-conservative message. Government is fine. It's just run by stupid people. Put me in charge, and I will make government work for you. It's one of the main critiques as to why the conservatives are against it. Cruz is, and by the way, people helping Trump out are really Jeff Sessions and Mike Flynn. Mike Flynn actually decently conciliatory towards Russia, and Jeff Sessions very anti-immigrant. Just say a bit on that background, because I don't know. Yeah, so Mike Flynn, is a former lieutenant general in the Army, was the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and it's been incredibly, since he retired, has been incredibly outspoken against the Obama administration foreign policy. Jeff Sessions has been a longtime senator. Some would call him the heart of the conservative movement within government. He's a senator from Alabama. He has had very hard stances on immigration, and has said that it's been a lot of the problems for his constituents in his state and for the United States writ large. Almost natural fits. And Sessions has been talking for months about endorsing Trump when he came out, and it was this big thing. It really shouldn't have been that exciting. Cruz is about strong America. Cruz and Rubio are somewhat similar. Cruz is being helped by John Bolton, the stash himself, and Elliot Abrams. So you can imagine a very anti-internationalist but very activist foreign policy and a very pro-Israel stance. Sanders has Bill French from the National Security Network. Bill's a great guy, but he was in the National Security Network, a very progressive foreign policy organization. Thing is that he was just announced as the lead of this group fairly recently.
He's also, he's almost the group, right? I didn't look at with Hillary in a moment, but
right.
Virtually everyone is in the Hillary camp and no one is in the Sanders camp.
Yeah,
there's on the Democrat Party.
I don't think so. Part of the problem with the Sanders campaign is that they moved on this too late. So even those who might have had some sort of hope for that Sanders would call them, I don't think they're going to jump ship now. And so now I would assume that Bill is calling whoever he can, probably asking folks for help. Now, that said, Bill is very capable. I'm sure some people he's bringing in are very capable. But the Hillary camp is everybody. It's just everybody in Democratic politics who wants a job, who does believe in her message. And she's also picking up a bit of the neocon endorsement, Robert Kagan coming out. And
could get a lot more.
And could get more. So you just have this weird sense of a sort of, I'm the smartest guy in the room, Trump, yet a very isolationist foreign policy. I'm the heart of the conservative small guy movement, but we're going to go abroad in the world. Sanders is the foreign policy sort of matters, and Clinton is I am the most experienced, and I have everyone behind me.
A lot depends on who's going to win, right? If Sanders looked like he was a more credible candidate for the presidency, more people would jump ship to him, right? If he'd won more primaries, more people.
Maybe. I don't think he's acerbic like Trump is. There is no hashtag Never Sanders. So, I don't think that a bunch of Hillary.
There might be if centrists and right wingers tweeted.
Maybe, but even so, I don't think you'll have Democrats coming out against Sanders unless he comes out and says, "Actually, I'm Marxist." In which case, then that may actually happen. But this Democratic, so it's not as toxic as Trump's stances for the Republican Party.
And he's not the same threat.
Does anyone care about the advisor kind of thing? Not in the slightest.
No. Yeah, okay. So most Americans take their cues on foreign policy from the elite, who is essentially this room, right? The media and people on TV, but they don't take. Most Americans don't self-educate on foreign policy issues. We know this. We've asked a lot about it, and they don't seek new information, especially new information that disagrees with a loosely held concept of if they are more sort of broadly interventionist. It's not even that they self-identify as a sort of, more bullish, etc. It comes down to partisan identity. People identify as Democrat or Republican, and that's sort of how they feel foreign policy should go. It's so far away from the experience of average everyday Americans, even those who have military personnel in their family or military personnel themselves. It doesn't mean they're necessarily much more highly engaged in American foreign policy issues. We do 11,000 surveys a month, so we can report on families of veterans and families of active duty, and the attitudes are actually not that different. We expected it would be way more informed, and they are certainly more informed and more able to accurately answer like quiz questions about foreign policy issues, but not by a huge amount. It's just not, it's not top of mind when it comes to a political agenda at all. It's very much about what have you done for me lately in terms of my pocketbook, in terms of my health care.
Let me just jump on that because I think that's an important subtext of both some of what's fueling Trump and Sanders and tying it back to foreign policy. We will not conceive of it as a foreign policy issue.
Yeah.
But I think what's happened is for 60 years, the rise of America as a superpower after World War II, and then the sustaining of America as a superpower and that superpower role for many generations was also sold that this was something good for ordinary Americans. This was good because American farmers, American business, American transport companies were all benefiting from America playing a global role.
And it was a trade and troops overseas.
It was a trade and troops overseas, but then with Main Street benefiting from it. Because now I think you have, rightly or wrongly, people perceiving that when they hear American leadership, it's America's being drained so that others can benefit, and I'm no longer benefiting. Trade is not about developing a system which benefits all. It's about others cheating America.
Exporting jobs.
And that the DC elite is in the service of those. They're against mainstream. Even the president, in that interview with Jeffrey Goldberg, at one point alludes and says, the think tanks in town that are in the pay, it essentially says in the pay of foreign governments advising that I should.
Which is actually, technically true in many cases. There's a reason we're a really, really cheap think tank.
Yeah.
But most think tanks are not really cheap, and therefore someone needs to pay for them.
Well, and I think that is fueling some of this rise of angst among voters, even if they don't identify it as a foreign policy issue, but this sense that they want, so when Trump or Sanders sounds these themes about I'm going to fight for you versus there are others out there, and that they want America to do things for them so that they don't have to do it, or because, again, the Trump rhetoric, it's simplistic, but it has a very core message, which is, smarter leaders around the world know how to fleece the United States. And you have not yet had a good response at that level of engagement that says, no, you benefit from America benefits from the fact that it writes the rules of the current global system. Right now, people are focused on their losses.
I want to come to you in a second, guys. But the difference between the military and the Washington foreign policy elite is that the military contains more normal people up to a point. So I want to get back to Alex on the foreign policy, kind of Alex is the representative of the foreign policy elite type something.
Sure, the guy who didn't show up in a blazer.
But how does the military perceives things, and including the enlisted people, like those fetch up the voting, differ from the way that the kind of Washington foreign policy world sees things?
Okay, this is disclaimer what you were saying. I'm going to be very honest with you. The military, they tend to have more people who think more right, more red. They like that tough guy attitude. But then again, they like to be safe, but they do like strong global leadership. Like one of the things where a couple of our sailors were taken from Iran, some are like, hey, let's go and get them. So they like that tough leadership. So
which candidate delivers that? Because it's not that clear in this election, right?
Trump does, as far as toughness.
Yeah.
And top leadership will kind of challenge Trump a little bit more, like, well, yeah, but what is your plan? What are you trying to do? That's where you see where, like, General Hayden, who kind of said, hey, you can't go in and do war crimes. That's against.
Top leadership have a bunch of kind of moral, ethical, and intellectual, predilections that are not necessarily shared by the rest of the military, right?
Right, exactly. It's just that he's a little bit more attractive because he stands on the right, like a majority of them do. So, but just one more point too, I just wanted to say as far as all this, I think also as far as Americans thinking less about foreign policy, more inward, it's also because, we're kind of saying this right now, but also because of the economic, political, and racial instability or inequality that's going on. So it's really making them think about what can you do for me? And you kind of have Sanders and Hillary championing on that, but then Trump is perceived as a movement that's against that. So people are feeling more inward and kind of like go against or vote for it. So
I see that the elections very, the theme is establishment versus anti-establishment, right? Because both Trump and Sanders are two sides of the same coin, right?
Right.
They're outside of the stricture of the establishment. Clinton embodies the establishment, and Sanders does not.
I mean, Heather Connolly, former Undersecretary of State for Europe, was in on our Europe discussion, and she framed both the Europe and the US and a lot of other discourses as as basically patriot/nationalists versus globalists.
Right.
Fits with Brexit, fits with maybe fits with Putin. You can put a lot of things into that sausage maker when it comes out. One quick thought on the military thing, and I'm going to throw it to Alex. I mean, it's almost the opposite of the situation after Vietnam or World War II, right? Where people came, in World War II, people came back and thought they'd done a good thing and then got jobs. In Vietnam, they came back, they thought it was a terrible idea, but they still got jobs. This time they've come back, they probably think it's a terrible idea, and they're not getting jobs, which is a really kind of toxic problem. I mean, Alex, the think tank row, I mean, how unrepresented is it? Of anybody really, but I mean the country and even the kind of elected leadership in the US.
Well, it's unrepresentative of the country because we actually spend our 9 to 5 and more reading and thinking about foreign policy. Most people think about living paycheck to paycheck, figuring their lives out. If they listen to the news at all and they see what's on the TV or listen to what's on the radio, that's their foreign policy experience. I mean, and plus news is very self-selected. So when you go and see the news now, especially today, you're going to go to a red or a blue site, and you're going to get the foreign policy information you want to get, or that's actually fed to you. Because news is now, especially TV news, is a very passive process. They tell you what's important.
So the world of a Trump supporter is genuinely a different world to the world.
No,
of
right.
Trump.
I mean, they're reading Breitbart, right? And now I'm going to sound elitist. I'm reading McKinsey reports, and that's not to say that one is better than the other. No, McKinsey's definitely better. But McKinsey's definitely better.
I've never read a McKinsey report.
That's fine. But I mean, again, but literally my job and the think tank job is foreign policy 9 to 5. That's a very, very small minority of Earth, let alone the American electorate. Two things I just quickly want to touch upon that were mentioned before. First is, I would actually disagree a bit with Asha. The tough guy in the room for the Republicans is not Trump. It's actually they've been three. It's been Cruz, Rubio, and Christie, two of which are gone. I mean, Christie and Rubio were literally giving speeches at the Council on Foreign Relations and other places with the only monikers of strong intelligence, stronger military, strong everything. Strong was everywhere, this peace through strength thing. And Trump's like, why are we giving money to NATO? Why are we in South Korea? Why are we still giving money to Japan and other countries?
I mean, almost nobody, it's a year ago, there were quite a lot of people saying Obama's mistake was not going in heavy, lots of troops into Syria. Right. That's almost dropped away to nothing.
Right. And plus, Trump's like, Iraq war was a bad idea. I mean, he's not the tough guy in the room.
And how he talks, he is.
Sure, but his tough guy persona is, I'm the guy that can do the right job. It's not, I'm the guy who's going to bomb the crap out of stuff. And then quickly, and I find this to be an interesting point, especially after the Goldberg article, is that despite Obama's incredible oratorical genius and ability, Trump's a way more effective communicator of how foreign policy affects your life.
That's almost the only thing he does, right? It's kind of, this will kill you. A bunch of Muslims will come to the country and one of them will shoot you. The Chinese will take your lunch and use your job. That's it. That's
Obama at best has told us, right, the don't do stupid shit line has told us that's not what we're going to do. He's never told us what we're going to do and how it affects you personally. Trump brilliantly and in sound bites tells you you'll die if this happens, you'll lose your job if that happens, America will lose if that happens. It's way more effective, if not as oratorically brilliant.
For the people who have to decide where America goes, top officials, people actually in government whose job it is to make sure that this country is still there in 25 years' time, that makes it quite a difficult kind of period, right?
Well, it does. But again, we've seen trends over the last 20 years across several administrations which are going to raise issues. One has been the increasing centralization of policy around the White House. People lambast Obama's administration for this, but it didn't start with him. It started at the end of the Cold War. It started as presidents felt bureaucracies were unresponsive to them, were not moving fast enough. They wanted to be able to control policy, both foreign and then domestic, so the attractiveness of czars and special envoys and other things. So we have this trend towards greater centralization. We've had the empowerment of an imperial presidency again in a variety of areas, whether, again, the ability of the last three presidents to now basically redefined congressional statute by signing statements, which was a very rare, non-existent process. But now a president's saying, well, here's this piece of law that I'll sign into law, but let me tell you what I think it means, and let me tell you what I think is advisory, and let me tell you, I'm not going to wait for the courts to have a challenge of the rule. Let me just tell you what I think is going to do. So the presidency now has immense power that it didn't have by statute 20, 25 years ago. And so the question then of who the next president is, either the president, whoever he or she is going to be faced with, do I want to still have all of this power concentrated in the White House? Presidents run and say, I'm going to return it to Congress and return it to the states, and they get to the White House, they discover Congress is gridlocked and nothing happens, and then, oh, well, these are good powers to have.
I just want to throw it to Julia.
So-
I mean, everyone always kind of sounds, it sounds on paper and in the kind of, in the Ivy League corridors of whatever they are, that I will be a humble president and I will return power. Lots of other people plays really well. It's not necessarily what people want back in the country itself, right?
No, they love Trump. I mean,
And anyone else who looks powerful.
right, exactly. I mean, America loves winners.
Yeah.
Honestly, I know
They
it
do.
sounds like
It's true, yes.
but 100%. I mean, Trump is,
Back-to-back World War champs.
yeah, exactly. And
UK
this
won a World Cup.
But this is the thing. I mean, that speaks very fundamentally to the American identity, to the American dream, and the idea of being more concessional or hedging is not American. And I think your point was brilliant, because the rhetoric that the candidates are using when they talk and what they're actually saying are totally different. I mean, even if he wins, Trump is not going to build a wall, but he has to say he's going to build a wall, right? That's how the game works, and he's so darn good at it, because that is absolutely what Americans want to hear. And I think the important point here is that people who vote in primary elections and people who vote in general elections are different people, like in many, many, many ways. Because primary voters also vote at the general, but primary voters represent between 5 and 30% of people in a state, and at caucuses, like I can't even talk about caucuses, right? But it's like 7 people. And then, and those people are extreme. Generally, I mean, Michigan was an interesting exception. We had pretty good turnout, and you had a much, that's why all the polls in Michigan, which we did not poll, by the way, were wrong, but because all these people came out that they didn't anticipate. But generally speaking, people who turn out to win a primary election, you have to be one person. And then to win a general election, you have to be a very different person. You have to be appealing to a much broader spectrum, because once Trump secures the nomination, which I
But Trump
think
may
he
be
will, he's going to pivot.
And
And he's going to
do that.
suddenly be, of course he is, he's Donald Trump, he can change his mind. I now
That's true.
think these other things that I didn't think before, because I am a grown-up who changes their mind. He can say these
And
things.
how does
because he's
the I'm a
Donald Trump,
grown-up
and he will.
How does the I'm a grown up who changes their mind thing work? Because no one ever dares do it.
Trump dares do everything.
But how do we know how it plays?
I-
Do people respect
Trump
the
has changed
I've
his
changed my mind
mind
thing or not?
so many times. There's so much footage of Trump saying that he believes in Planned Parenthood, and he believes all these things that he now no longer believes. It's not affected him one iota. I mean, I love all these compilation videos of him contradicting, himself, that are playing more on your MSNBCs, etc. Those don't even touch him. I mean, those are the people who are going to vote for him, and people who like Trump don't like him because he's message consistent. They like him because he's a winner and because he's strong and he's talking tough.
If John Kerry
And he's
switched,
going to save their jobs.
if John Kerry switched as much as Donald Trump has, he would have been even worse off. Like, I mean, John Kerry, the argument I remember Democrats were making was, yeah, he flip-flopped, but he's evolved, he's thought about the policy positions, he's come to different ideas, right? And then it doesn't matter, he flip-flopped, and Trump is literally doing it every day. But now he never told to give money, he would never pay the legal fees for the people who hit other people. And people are like, oh, okay, I guess he didn't do it.
But that's the thing, that he's moved so extreme that don't you think it'd be very difficult for him to
I think
get
it would be
little
tricky, but he's very careful, isn't he, what he says? Listen to his words. He's not ever committing 100% to things.
I mean, I also think, to be fair about this election, that all the candidates in this election, you know who you're getting. You know, if you vote Trump, he will change his mind 2 or 3 times in the Oval Office. That may or may not be something you're into. You could argue it's a good idea. If you vote Hillary, you get someone who is the establishment. If you vote Sanders, you get someone who's the left-wing establishment. If you get Cruz, you get a sort of more aggressive Trump who's going to make stones grow in the dark.
Peter, because then that also raises, and it goes back to your earlier question, which is that whoever gets elected has thousands of positions to fill. And the question is, if it were to be a Trump or a Sanders, at the end of the day, they're going to have a circle around them, but there's still going to be a permanent bureaucracy. You're going to bring people up. There's going to be continuity. We've seen this, we've seen it in Russia policy that from administration to administration, there's the top people will change, then there's continuity. I mean, how do you explain to Victoria Nuland? I was, in the Clinton administration with Steve Sestanovich and Stroh Talbot, then I went to work for Dick Cheney, then I went to work for Hillary Clinton. I mean there's a certain continuity that so that even if Trump comes in,
it will be the usual suspects, the secretary, whatever.
To some extent, I mean, he may have some influence. He may pick his 10 or 20 issues where he really will concentrate, and for every issue he picks, he will have to cede another 10 issues where he'll either be continuity or he's not going to monitor it because he just simply can't monitor. So he can say, I'll pick the Russia portfolio, Israel, Palestine, maybe a couple of, China, Mexico, but that then means, well, Brazil and India and nuclear deterrent, he'll be ceding that to someone else.
But that's kind of one of the lessons of the Obama presidency, right? Is that 9/10 of the jobs went to all the people who had done the same jobs in Hillary Clinton's presidency.
Yes.
It's only the inner sanctum that doesn't change.
The question for Hillary, though, is will she fill a 400-person NSC with campaign staffers?
Well, aren't they cutting NSC right now?
Well, a little bit. A little bit. I mean,
Down.
I don't think a Clinton administration would have 400 NSC members. They'll probably get to 200. But the question is, will 150 of them be literally 25-year-olds who are people who never had national security?
Which almost renders the point of it, the point of it non-existent, right? I mean, a 200-person NSC isn't an NSC. You go back to who the 8 people are and count.
But even so, a lot of, like, for example, what was it? When the funeral was, that ceremony out in Europe when the Obama administration said, oh, sorry, we didn't know that funeral was happening. Like, we have a 400-person NSC. How did you not know that?
So this is the funeral after Charlie Hebdo.
Yes,
right,
right.
Which no one
right, and they were having the massive sort of ceremony, and apparently there were about 30 European-focused NSC members. Not one of them got the memo of this thing. So obviously the big size is actually a hindrance. It's one issue. I don't how Clinton would change.
I mean, if you can
fail
fail to predict a funeral, it does beg the question as to how you're going to fail to predict any of the more other serious things that might happen.
Right. So what for me, sort of the big question for her is who she's going to have in the State Department or DOD, all that stuff. That's kind of already done. But who will she have with her day to day in the White House? That is the biggest question, and how many of those people does she have?
Any thoughts on that, Asha? I've got another question to bounce back to this.
Well, this might be a little bit of an outlier, but it's just amazing how the Trump phenomenon is pretty much taking over about Hillary Clinton being probably the first woman president.
Mm-hmm.
That was a theme in 2008. Oh, first black president or first female president. And she's actually looking like she's going to be the first female nominee. And it's not really talked about.
I wonder whether it's partly because, despite that, I'm not quite sure what the phrase is for what Trump is, but he is definitely the first one of them. And therefore, people, therefore in terms of idiosyncrasy, and there's definitely a gender issue there, a gender bias, but I think there's also a kind of, that's kind of interesting, but it's kind of, whatever the hell this is, it's definitely worth looking at.
It's the Republican Party 2.0 though, right? The Republican Party is falling apart because it's not even bifurcating anymore. It's breaking into a few
vulcanized
different
into a sort of
pieces.
survival
Yeah.
type thing.
But you have sort of the earlier Tea Party and then the later Tea Party, and you have the sort of McCain, more sort of centrist Republican. You have all these different groups, and of course Trump is of none of them. Trump adopted the Republican Party. He's not of the Republican Party because there is no Republican Party. I love the conversations about brokered conventions about how all the people in rooms behind the scenes smoking cigars are gonna
they don't exist.
figure it out for Cruz. They don't exist anymore. That doesn't exist. There's not a group of senior people who sit and make decisions.
It's like the secret rulers of the world.
Right.
They're just not there.
For the Republican Party anymore because it's too divided. There are little fiefdoms, of course, but it's going through a fundamental transition right now. And the result is Donald Trump. And so I think he represents actually the new wave of sort of where the Republican Party or what the Republican Party becomes is going to go. And I think we're talking a lot about the next Clinton presidency, but I also would say that our data basically suggests that Trump has got a really, really good chance of taking it.
The other thing I think is that a Hillary presidency may only be a one-term presidency, so we then have all these conversations 4 years down the line. Which brings me to my next question. You said America likes winners.
They do.
The problem for America, though, is that by any if you look at the world, America is going to be less relatively powerful compared to other people in the world in 4 years' time or 8 years' time. It may still be the dominant superpower, but more bits of its lunch will get eaten under virtually any model that you possibly look at. And that's a really hard thing for American people and American candidates to get their heads around, right? And particularly hard for people to craft a decent narrative for. I mean, Nick, America is not going to lose its hegemonic position overall, but it's going to weaken, right?
It'll be weakened. It will be because groups of powers can pick away at it, because just the structure of the international system is changing as power diffuses. And also, we've lost certain habits. Republicans all love to invoke Reagan, but they ignore that Reagan operated within the bipolar system. He was successful, but there were lots of things Reagan didn't do. Reagan did not launch crusades into Eastern Europe. He did not talk about marching to the Kremlin with American tanks. It was, we're going to manage the Cold War, let the Soviet Union implode, because he thought that's where it was headed, but pulls us out of Lebanon when things get, his wins were careful. Grenada.
I mean, he's a post-Vietnam president.
He's a post-Vietnam president, but he also operated with a better sense of American limitations, what America could do, where America's strengths were. And then end of the Cold War, this is my worry bringing to the military side, and I see this. We've gotten very used over the last 20 years to operating in extremely permissive environments around the world.
I'm not sure Asha felt they felt that way.
They may not have felt that way, but you think about being able to operate in Afghanistan without worrying about air defense networks, without worrying about a Taliban air force, without worrying about, and you think
a large
about
country with a nuclear
a
arsenal.
large country with a nuclear arsenal, and then you see, well, wait a minute, we're going to have to tangle with China somewhere.
But also not tackle with China, because then the world ends.
Then the world ends. Well, that forces a discipline back upon your policy process that we could say, 1999, Kosovo, Albanians are being persecuted. We're going to intervene. Russia's relatively weak. They don't like it, but they're going to have to more or less accept it. 1999 was a peculiar. The 90s was a peculiar period in world history that was not the norm, and unfortunately, I think some people internalize it that the world of the 90s would exist forever.
And it did exist for a long time, right? Because it's only. You could argue that Syria is the first time it did.
Well, and the shoot down of the Russian jet by the Turks, I think, was a very scary wake-up call for a lot of people, suddenly realizing how quickly this could spiral out of control.
I want to throw it to Alex on how the elites adapt to that, because I
love how I'm representing elites always.
Not even wearing a blazer.
I know.
But most of our lives are doing this stuff. There has been a problem, and the question is, how does America solve it? And America has a great toolkit, and no one else has got anything. And you sit down and you come up with a plan, you've got a carrier battle group and an IMF loan, and then you fix the problem. Those models don't really work that way now.
No, I mean, it's a different kind of, so the National Security Act of 1947 set us up for the Cold War period, and we just haven't had a completely different change. How big is cyber going to be in the future? How big is biotech going to be, and all those kinds of things? How many experts on the NSC or in state or India are actually have the presidency here on a daily basis on these kinds of things that are going to be way more important down the line? And what kind of authority should they have? Should we even have the same kind of departments? What's bothering me, and to take this a little broader, is this campaign, especially on the foreign policy discussion, has literally been about whose dick is bigger. Has literally been about it, and we're missing all these incredibly important foreign policy questions that no one's asking themselves, like what, and I'll be very broad, but I could go more specific. What is the goal vis-a-vis China? How do you deter Russia? How do you bring up and develop, how do you integrate and take advantage of, to a certain extent, developing economies in Africa and Latin America? How do you actually work, how do you actually make the pivot without abandoning European allies? All these things that should be so basic in foreign policy 101 aren't even being discussed.
Because they're not being discussed, people are genuinely not thinking about it.
Yeah,
it means there are a bunch of candidates who are not thinking about it.
To Julia's point, the foreign policy things that people talk about are what elites tell them, and our candidates are elites by definition now, and they're not talking about it. They're talking about what kind of targeted carpet bombing we're going to do. And it's a really different kind of foreign policy conversation.
Right, like for instance, what the Obama administration I've seen, I'm from New York, so see that UN world situation go on. From the Bush to Obama administration, they poured so much money into their mission and they expanded their role there. They're working with so many different countries. So you see that Obama had more of a interest in doing multilateral things, especially in addressing issues like Libya or Iraq or Syria, using that multilateral approach, you know, dealing with Iran. And it's just going back to your point exactly, like the UN, even though it's not that popular, it is important, and Trump's headquarters is right across the street, and he never talks about it at all. And I'm just like, wow, I cannot get over this.
And I bet you probably could name the 5 members of the permanent members of the Security Council. Maybe one larger point also tying to what Nick said, and then let's see on this, which is, if I have one grand theory about where all this went wrong to the U.S., it's that, you know, after World War II, the plan was, it wasn't altruistic, but the plan was, we're going to stay number 1, but we're going to give others a little benefit. And this is the strategic restraint argument, right? We're not going to take over so much. We're going to keep our power at number 1, but we're going to let others rise, and that will actually help us out because other states will be more stable and more helpful. And then we totally forgot to plan for when we got to that kind of world.
I mean,
and now the reminder is up on our Google alert, and we're going, oh wait, other states are here, and we have no idea what's going on.
I think it is unreasonable to expect Harry Truman to plan for a scenario that happens.
No, I'm not expecting him, but I'm hoping
it's our/your problem, not his.
No, I'm not blaming Truman. He did. I thought that was the right thing to do. I mean, sure, maybe the end of the what for Leo's viewing, the end point of this is blame Truman. No. No, it's not Truman's fault, but it is. I mean, if that was the grand design, someone at some point should have gone, let's plan for that kind of world. And at best, we've gotten to how do we just maintain our overall power? It hasn't been, and that's one argument you can make about dealing with this kind of world, but there's so many other options that we never grappled with. And we haven't even done well with our one suggestion.
I mean, I wonder whether this is one of the, I mean, I'm fascinated by the way we're all so obsessed with terrorism, despite the fact that it is, you know, on the numbers level, I mean, you know, compared to car crashes, you know, there's just a lot of stuff in the world that it causes more problems than terrorism unless you happen to live in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, or Nigeria, the handful of countries where it kills more people than anywhere else. For most of us, it's not a really big problem. But, you know, someone like Obama, the NSC spends an enormous amount of time trying to find a bloke in a shack who wants to get on a plane with some underpants, and I get why that is, but it's become massively disproportionate in terms of, and no one is doing the what do we do about Europe, or, you know, the questions where if we get them wrong, the world may burn down on the ready, so everyone loses their jobs, right?
And just some data on that point, actually. It's interesting because there's, for the American public, there's a little bit of rationality on that, and then total irrationality. So immediately, this is all event-driven, right? Concern about terrorism is event-driven. So after Paris and after Santa Bernardino, it became the #1 issue, and I'm seeing my chart in my mind. But so the economy is always #1, but then you get these spikes of terrorism, in particular when an event occurs, and that's actually just started to recede. It's now down below the economy, but I think it's still second, maybe dropping to third at the moment, as concern about that recedes again as it fades in our memories. But after, I think, Boston, we did some interesting questions on if people are more fearful of, in the United States, random acts of violence, acts of domestic terror, or acts of foreign terror. And actually more people say random acts of violence, which is probably rational than the other two, but it's about 40, 30, 20, right? So concern about being a victim of a foreign launched terrorist attack is insanely high compared to relative actual risk.
Maybe it requires a country where it doesn't happen very often, because actually paradoxically, you know, Paris, you know, got attacked, they viewed it as a really big deal. I was talking to both some French and Brits in London, and the sort of Brits went, yeah, well, this, you know, 7/7, that's kind of, I mean, you know, the Tudor was awful. You know, you know, but then London is used to being, you know, on a 70 or 80 year basis. Right. You know, there used to be 2 or 3 bombs a year when I was growing up. Small ones only killed 1 or 2 people. 7/7 killed a lot more. But there's a level of kind of, well, we're not going to do the world differently because a bomb goes off in London. That would be insane. Whereas if things happen really, really rarely, they actually have a higher impact. I mean, Pakistani politics is not dictated by the Taliban. Bizarrely, it kills shitloads of people, but it's not. But that's never the top issue in Pakistani politics. I mean, it's not really become the top issue in Russia, right? Despite what spikes up it.
Yeah, it's a psychological question more than perceived risk versus actual.
You remember the media coverage prior to the election? I mean, it was all about police brutality issues, just people out of nowhere attacking people on the street or shooting. And I mean, that inundated the media. And I think that kind of filled everybody's head up just thinking more domestically. And then we went right into elections. So those concerns just carry right into it.
Yeah, they absolutely do.
But what's your take on the level of priority that everyone, both candidates, public, and also particularly the media and the sort of think tankerati, are going to give to stuff? Because we've got everyone's got massive counterinsurgency programs at the moment, massive counterterrorism programs, a project on Iraq and Syria that takes up 2/3 of their think tank. They've got a China guy, which became a China team.
Right.
They've got a large cyber team funded by Northrop Grumman that suddenly magicked into existence 3 years ago. And they probably now have a Europe thing for the last 2 years, right? But I mean, how is that going to shape up going forward?
Well, what's interesting is that
Which is already more representative than it would have been like 2 years ago.
Sure. I mean, if there's one thing that I think think tanks are a very good bellwether for, it's the state of the environment and how the DC elite sees the foreign policy world. So if you see new centers popping up, it's because that's the kind of new hit thing. For example, and I work in it, the strategy initiative at the Atlantic Council, we're just one of many like grand strategy projects that are happening within the think tank community. Why? Because there's this narrative that the Obama administration has just failed completely on strategic thinking. And so now everyone and their mother is now working on grand strategy, and it's all the same stuff. Although the Atlantic Council were doing completely great things.
Obviously, it's different.
The Atlantic Council were doing great things.
None of which is espoused by the electorate or any of the candidates.
No, all of this is, I mean, this is when people talk about inside versus outside the Beltway, right? Inside the Beltway, we all care about this stuff tremendously. But let me give a story that I find fascinating and I think is emblematic. So my colleague, Robbie Gramer, who is basically helps lead our NATO work, right? His grandfather lives out in Idaho. And one day he went out to go visit his grandfather and his family. And the grandfather asked him, "What do you do for work?" And Robbie goes, "Well, I work on NATO issues in DC." And then his grandfather goes, "What's a NATO?" So, whereas
his great-grandfather would have known.
Maybe in a way, but I guess my general point is, especially at a place like the Atlantic Council, we treat NATO like it's the bellwether of all things transatlantic values, and I'm sure it is. But for many people out in the world, NATO is just that thing over there.
And that's really important, because one day the question might be, are you willing to risk a nuclear war because someone just invaded NATO? And if the question is, what's a NATO, then the political implications are rather different to what we thought they were in the 80s.
The leading Republican candidate is outwardly talking about why are we still part of this thing and why are we funding it at the levels we are.
I mean, Nick, what are your thoughts on that? We'll wrap up in a second. But
Well, I mean, this goes back to, commitments that are made and what the depth of popular support or understanding of them is. When NATO was smaller and there was a Soviet threat, there was a compelling narrative that said, if Western Europe falls to a Soviet force, America is in peril. We fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over here, and we want to fight them there so that
we also the Iraq War narrative, the Afghan War narrative.
That's the standard narrative. Today with NATO, right, you have NATO expansion. 3 rounds of NATO expansion went through the Senate with no debate, we were extending security guarantees, either because we thought we would never be called on them because Russia was our friend or Russia was finished as a great power. You never debated that. Now,
there was no Senate vote on it.
No, the Senate voted, but there was no, when you look at the first NATO debate in 1949, you have weeks of this is violating Washington's dictum.
And the League of Nations debate didn't go through, which is
the League of Nations
never worked.
didn't go through. But expanding NATO, the rounds of NATO expansion just went through, almost, just by pro forma. And now you have, if you're in the Baltic states and you turn around and you say, you've got this real big problem with Russia to the east, and it's not just the United States. I mean, half of Germans say Article 5 doesn't apply to Estonia. If Estonia gets attacked by Russia, well, too bad. Well, Article 5 is the heart of the alliance. But if you're taking on commitments, and it's not that every voter has to know everything about it, but you have to have the narrative of why these alliances matter.
Because Ukraine had a bunch of guarantees which no one knew about, and they turned out not to count.
Well, and they weren't legal guarantees because the Clinton administration knew they could not get a treaty through the Senate in 1994. So they kind of did bait and switch. If Ukrainians believe it's a treaty because they recorded it in their register.
I think they may now have moved on from that.
I think they have, but at the time they thought it was, well, we give up our nukes, we get the Russians, the Brits, and the Americans guarantee our territorial integrity. But I mean, we see that with the EU as well, the same crisis in the EU of expansion. No one really cares when the economy is good. You get a blank check for foreign policy. You can expand. When the economy is bad, people then start saying, wait a minute, why are the Romanians why are they in it? Why does Estonia have a security guarantee? And if you don't have that compelling narrative of why it matters, and going back to my point about mainstream, that we had a narrative in the Cold War that it mattered to you because your national survival was at stake. Now, we may have exhausted that by how the Iraq War and other things went on, but there was a narrative that now people today say, and we see with the polling numbers on Syria, right? It's a tragedy, it's terrible, but I don't want to go there, and I don't want them coming here.
I'm going to take one round of questions quickly, and then we'll wrap up. Anyone got any questions? Yourself. You can just introduce yourself and say who you are.
Sure. I'm David Gerard Gross, and I'm the founder of an internet startup. A geopolitically relevant one, to say. I have a question, a general question. Do any of you have a pulse on what's going on in terms of the lead candidates lining up their VP choices?
Anyone else have any questions? Yourself.
Sure. So I was going to ask, we've got limited, I'll introduce myself first. I'm Zach Biggs. I'm a reporter with Jane's Defense Weekly. So we've got limited data to work from here, but if we talk a transition from Obama to Clinton, a couple of examples where we see disagreements, such as arming Syrian rebels, such as disagreement over the don't do stupid shit line, a couple of points, but what would more broadly a Clinton administration look like as far as a departure from Obama, as far as intervention, et cetera, which we hear consistently may be a bigger part of her mission?
Okay, any other questions? Yourself.
Yeah, foreign policy doesn't seem to matter, but when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, there are forces that make it matter. And Trump has come out and said, well, he's taking an impartial view toward the situation. Now, I've never heard anyone say that before, or did say that before. Has it hurt him in any way?
You've annihilated Obama. I mean, let's throw it to Alex first on those three questions.
Oh boy. Okay. Lead candidate VPs. I mean, it's too early in the game for many of them. Probably the most you've heard right now is for Hillary Clinton. It's Tim Kaine. It seems to be the name thrown around, the senator from Virginia, former governor. For the rest of them, who knows? It's too early. I don't even know who would want to be Trump's running mate. It could be Christie, although the rumor is it's Attorney General, but who knows? But then if he gets, if he's no longer governor of New Jersey, he may just seek a job. So honestly, who knows? There just really isn't that much out there. Again, it's early in the game. What would a Clinton foreign policy look like? Probably a little Stronger, more activist, I would say, than Obama. Probably a little more willing to use American power. But what does that mean? How would she view that? I'll put it this way: if the Obama administration, and I'll steal the Goldberg line, has been judge me by what I have not done, I think Clinton will probably go the opposite way. She'll judge me by what I am doing, and she'll probably use a very DC elitist term, since I'm representing that, the all elements of national power kind of formulation. And I think it would actually be, this is similar to the Obama thing, but I don't think he's articulated as well. As her message is, I'm going to make the best I can for all Americans, period, opportunity. How she does that in the foreign policy realm, I don't know, and whether she expands that opportunity message to other countries, like, for example, reforming the Permanent Five or the WTO, all that stuff, that might be part of it. The Israel-Palestine thing, first of all, I just don't think that matters that much anymore in terms of the debate. John Kerry cares a lot about it. He wants to be the guy that solves it, but other than that, it's not really in the psyche of many. It's definitely not in the psyche of this administration. It's definitely not in the psyche. I think it has barely been talked about, period, as a big issue in the debate. I think the Middle Eastern problems have completely usurped that issue at this point. So in a way, Trump could get away with it, because as long as he's still willing to bomb ISIS, who really cares what he says about Israel and whatnot? But at the end of the day, he's gone completely against orthodoxy for his party, for everything, and he's sailing through to a certain extent.
Yes, with regards to VP, initially for Clinton, there was some rumors going around that Julian
Castro,
Castro
that's right.
would be the mayor from San Antonio. But I think that may change based on her not getting enough of the white male vote. Possibly she might be losing that edge. So that may change to where it can go to Tim Kaine, based on what may happen today. For Trump, I will say that Governor Christie looks like he's posturing himself on around following him. But there was a video back in, I think, in the 90s or late 90s where somebody asked Trump, "You want from the president?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Who would be your running mate?" He said, "Oprah Winfrey." I don't know if she would accept it.
That would be, they would win so hard, but
I think he
it'd be a
will.
slaughter.
He will find a minority because of the movement that's going
You're right,
on.
and that's a really dangerous dynamic.
Yeah.
If it's a woman of
Right, a woman of color or a woman, Spanish, someone of color or whatever that may like get rid of this like movement against him. So I think he'll do that.
Sorry, there's that senator or congresswoman from Utah who became like sort of a national sensation.
Oh yes, yes.
African American
The
woman.
mayor, yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
It's like, oh my God, it's an African American woman
Yes,
who's in the GOP and she won.
yes,
That's-
yes. That's
Put
the
her on
point.
the list.
In terms of Clinton's foreign policy, as far as moving forward with that, I agree with you as far as being more hawkish. That's how you explain it. I look at it more pragmatic, but people look at more hawkish than President Obama. But I think she's going to tie more in with how we can gain economically. When she was Secretary of State, she said to her diplomats, "Look, you just don't read about politics. Read about the economy too, and how we can secure opportunities abroad to help better our economy." So I think she's going to tie that in more, especially based on what's going on right now in the elections. So she's probably going to bring that more to the table as a president. And as far as the Israel Palestine situation, yes, I think it's a dead issue, but I will tell you, I think it didn't really impact Trump because we've already seen this new phenomenon with Iran deal, where it was kind of viewed as, oh, something against Israel. So then people kind of were really upset about it and they got over it. So now with this piece, that might have gave it like more of a cushion to allow his rhetoric or his thoughts about what he would do with the Israel-Palestine deal.
Julia.
Yeah, and I'll go in backwards order because I'll pivot from that point, which is that I agree essentially, and I just from a public opinion perspective, it's still fairly non-committal. If we again remember like sort of the average American's level of awareness of these issues, the sensitivity, of course everybody knows that the issue broadly is sensitive, but that his response was perhaps non-typical is not, we can't even assume that that's known. So he's, as usual, saying things that sound committed without actually making a verbal commitment to things, which he's excellent at, and I think is
3 marriages per day.
right. Exactly. I can't comment on the Clinton-Obama one. That's something for the people who know more about foreign policy than I do.
I really want to know what you hear about the vice president.
But this is the thing I'm going to just disappoint, is that I agree there've not been any good rumors, at least not any that I can trust, I don't think, coming out of the various camps. I think they need to, as all VPs do, right, you need to pick people who help to shore up your weaknesses. And I'm assuming it's going to be Trump-Clinton. I'm assuming Clinton was going to pick probably somebody who, I don't know who that person was, but she's going to have to pivot because Sanders is proved to be much more formidable than she anticipated, and his appeal is younger. His appeal is obviously more liberal and male to a certain extent. And I don't know that that means she needs to pick a young male, but she needs to pick somebody who really can capture that audience and their imagination a little bit.
What she really needs is a young Barack Obama, am I right?
Interestingly, I mean, I think she could go. I don't know where her campaign is going to go, and because I'm going to assume it's going to be Trump, although that's not quite a done deal. Although I agree tonight.
Well, not in a couple hours.
It's not so far. She could. I mean, in order to win, like our calculations that this is kind of a Republican year. It's Clinton. Clinton has the uphill battle. She would have to, I think in order to really make this a race that she can win, she needs to bring something entirely new to the game. And so I think picking a minority woman and having a double female ticket would be pretty game changing. I think that she needs to make her campaign
In a good
about
way.
anyone but Trump. And for her, and I mean, at the moment, I think she's the weaker candidate if it's her and Trump. Like I think he can beat her. She embodies the establishment and he embodies the anti-establishment. And if we assume he'll pivot enough to be palatable to most Republicans, I think he can walk home with it easily. And she needs to be radically different in order to combat that. She needs to do something.
I mean, that's kind of my takeaway, is that this is the era of Trump, whether he wins or not. Because people like him, if he doesn't win, then there'll be another Trump against Hillary in 4 years' time from that kind of persuasion, who may well win, maybe a bit more centrist. If he doesn't win, there'll be a bunch of Trumps elsewhere who are doing stuff. And, you know, and he's far too recognizable for it not to be the name of the era. I mean, Nick, what's your thoughts on those things?
Well, let me just pivot off your last point there at the beginning, is that no matter what happens, Trump, and Alex at this point about, you know, blowing up orthodoxies. Trump has said things that now will make it easier for other candidates in the future to start saying. Whether it's Israel, Palestine,
So you should abandon Israel. You can talk about
not abandon Israel, but you know, and the other thing I think where it goes back is the extent it will be a test of whether or not Trump's 19th century. And I think it's true. And I think it's one reason why Putin kind of indicated, oh, I can work with Trump, because they both see the world in 19th century terms. It's guys sit around the table with the map, and they trade, and they horse trade, and they bargain, and they come to a deal. And
there are no women in the room.
And there were modern. You know, Catherine the Great was not an insignificant presence, and Maria Theresa were not insignificant presences.
Elizabeth I played this game very well.
Yeah, Elizabeth did it.
But you could see Trump saying like, "Oh, she's not giving me what I want in foreign policy. It must be something going on with her."
And the she would be Angela Merkel. But
Yeah.
Because like everyone he's ever disagreed with, he's just talked about anatomy.
Yeah. But you know, on these questions, so on Israel, Palestine, I think what he's saying is that it's interesting, because what he said, you know, then he said, well, look, I marched in the parade, and you know, I look at my daughter and my grandchild.
I have good relations with the blacks, and it's, you know, that kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, but this idea that I'm a deal maker, I can take these intractable conflicts because politicians don't act like deal makers. And if they were only deal makers, and you lock them in the room and you haggle it out like a piece of real estate, I think he's making that pitch that fundamentally this is a real estate problem in the Middle East, and you know, eminent domain, he'll use the same toolbox. Now, whether that's an effective toolbox is another question altogether. Clinton taking over from Obama, I mean, that becomes an interesting thing, because again, with every candidate we've seen, Clinton, Bush, Obama, they've
Trump.
Yeah.
You might go, oh my goodness.
But I mean, Trump will be Trump, right? I mean, you know, he will ignore what people tell him and do what he wants to do, rightly or wrong.
Rightly or wrong. And on the VP question, and this is just what we've heard in New England, so this is the outside the Beltway. There was talk about Warren, about would Hillary go to Warren to kind of capture the Bernie momentum, and then have a double woman ticket, and that with Trump, the rumor that made its way around Newport, which I have no idea knowing where it came from or any substance, was General Mattis as a VP. That Trump brings a hard-charging military guy who's also, you know, and then kind of locks up the national security votes. Yeah, and beloved, and then says, you know, two outsiders, you know, guy who, you know, spoke his mind and got cashiered, and now he's going to be my guy. Or that he has to do, in the same way what Obama did, you have to find, you know, a counterpart of Mr. Inside. So that Trump says, I'm the negotiator, I go out, but now you know I have a VP who can run or Cheney or, you know, whatever. The modern
military one would probably, I mean, I've been amazed that there have not been more generals entering politics in the last 5-6 years in this country, because I think they have a cachet that the country
that could just
could
be
probably go with.
Marines that are attracted to the idea of Mattis.
He did say he wanted someone in new government.
Yeah.
So that's.
But he can't go too close. It can't be establishment. It can't be part of
But
the
a-
system, which is why a military trial, I think that's interesting.
Particularly Greece,
actually.
right? Because they're the kind of outsiders of the.
But I think that would, get more
Well,
traction.
Thank you. Had like 35 ideas I didn't have when this discussion started, so it's been good for me on a purely selfish basis. So we'll continue doing these. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I think we've had a really, really great panel, and we will be back in 2 weeks' time doing a discussion on think tanks. We're going to get really, really navel gazing.
Oh man.
Nagar Razavi, an anthropologist who studies think tanks, so she's a proper anthropologist, and she looks at think tanks like most anthropologists look at Amazon tribal societies, is going to be talking to me, someone from the George Mason Center, and somebody else. I forget the panel, but it should be a really interesting discussion, and it will not be requiring Alex to represent the entire.
Can I be the anti-establishment? It's like think tanks.
Very popular.
Yeah.
So I'd like to thank and apologize to our panel for everything I've said and done. Thank you very much indeed. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.